Hello, I'm Deacon Jeff, and this is our reflection for Wednesday, February 16th. When I say the word grace, it may bring to mind different things for different people of different generations. I think for people in my parents' generation, may remind them of Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly was an actress and a famous model during the 1950s, who subsequently became the Princess of Monaco. She was born a Catholic Irish girl in Philadelphia who rose to fame and became a fashion icon, known as much for her generous spirit as for her sense of personal style and poise. As an adult, as Princess of Monaco, she actually founded several philanthropies benefiting children. She is said to have stated her last wish to be remembered as a kind and loving person who leaves a memory of one with a correct attitude who did her best to help others. What a beautiful sentiment, huh? Of course, for people of more current, like my generation, grace may bring to mind that rock and roll icon Grace Jones of the 1980s, also a runway model and an actress, the daughter of a Protestant bishop and the sister of a fairly famous television evangelist who kind of eschewed that lifestyle, one might say, and developed her own sense, very unique sense of personal style, which was made famous in her movie roles and in her modeling on runways as well. Of course, for more recent generations, Grace may bring to mind the current actress Maggie Grace. She's also a runway model, best known perhaps for her role as Liam Neeson's daughter in the Taken movies, or for some of her roles in some TV series. And although, like both Grace Kelly and Grace Jones, she was a runway model, she says about herself that she's in fact very clumsy and often trips over her own feet. She's in fact been nicknamed Maggie Grace Less. Now, all three of these graces are models and have grace in their name. And that word grace, the dictionary gives two primary definitions for. The first definition is an elegance and refinement of movement, like runway models. And the second definition is an air or disposition of courteous kindness and goodwill toward others. Now, of course, as people of faith, I would hope that that word grace might bring to mind a different kind of grace altogether. That being spiritual grace, which our church defines as a supernatural gift from God to men and angels for their eternal salvation, whether retained through salutatory acts by which we receive actual grace, or through a state of holiness by which we receive sanctifying grace. You know, grace is perhaps one of the most important and yet maybe one of the most difficult things in our faith to really understand. In describing the nature of grace, trying to get to the heart of what this spiritual grace is about, the Catholic Encyclopedia says that the real nature of sanctifying grace is by reason of its invisibility. Can't see it, smell it, taste it, hear it. It is veiled in mystery, so that we can learn its nature better by a study of its formal operations, rather than by an attempt to study the grace itself. In other words, you can't really see it, taste it, smell it, feel it, but you know it when you see it in people. That, you know, that secular kind of grace, that elegance of movement, or that disposition of courteous kindness and goodwill to others, or that sense of holiness that we often see in people. And that's what our Mass readings today are all about. In our first reading from the letter of St. James, he calls us to avoid anger and excess, hard emotions. Rather, we should try to listen to others, be patient with them, be humble, let others go first, and have an awareness of how others perceive us, a kind of a disposition to kindness and goodwill. But he goes on to say that disposition alone isn't enough, that we also must cooperate with that free gift that God gives us, that grace, in order for it to be effective. That we need to practice what we preach, to walk the walk, kind of like runway models who walk that walk, but in real life, to walk the walk of that sense of holiness, to avoid falling away from it as a result of peer pressure, and to demonstrate a care for others over and above ourselves. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the preparation of man for the reception of grace is already a work of grace. The latter is needed to arouse and sustain our collaboration in justification through faith and in sanctification through charity. God brings to completion in us what he has begun, since he who completes his work by cooperating, we need to cooperate with that free gift in order for that grace to really be effective. And we see this disposition being a prompting to greater grace in our gospel today. The gospel today is from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus works his first cure of a blind man in the Gospel of Mark. This is kind of a unique miracle of Jesus in that it doesn't instantaneously happen. It takes 2 tries. And the commentators tell us that that's meant to bring home an important point Mark is using in his gospel, a literary device. Because you see, this part of Mark's gospel is known as the commentary on the way. And it begins with the cure of this first blind man, who it is said doesn't come to Jesus by himself, doesn't really care apparently. Others bring him to Jesus, and others beg Jesus to cure him. Apparently, he doesn't have a whole lot of faith. And so initially, Jesus gives him a little prompt, and he sees dimly. And now with this prompting, his faith grows. The grace in him is now growing. He's now prepared to cooperate with it. And in so doing, Jesus then completely restores his vision. And this is meant to be symbolic of what's happening with Jesus' apostles now, as Jesus turns around from way up north in the Holy Land and starts to make the way down to Jerusalem for his final passion. How his disciples need to gradually grow in this grace of understanding who this Jesus is. And this story is capped off by the second curing of the blind Bartimaeus in Jerusalem. And in the gospel, we hear that Bartimaeus actually is calling out to Jesus, Holy One, Messiah, Son of David, himself. He has the faith. He's full of grace. And Jesus comes to him, and the gospel says that immediately his blindness is cured. He has grown in the grace, hearing the stories of this great man, this great miracle worker, this Son of God, just as the disciples have grown in their grace along this path as well. And really, isn't that the story of each of our own spiritual growth? That we get those little promptings that we'll hopefully listen to, that we see the effect of grace in our lives occasionally, and that hopefully that by our last day, we too may say that we'd like to be remembered as a kind and loving person, and leave others with a memory of a person who had a correct attitude and who did their best to help others. Have a grace filled